Who was Saint Aldhelm then? He was what century did he live in? He was an
So,
Anglo-Saxon bishop, right?
yes. So he, um, there's debate about his birth. It's probably sometime between 635 and 640. We know his death was 709. He was a member of either a royal family or a major noble family. There's, again, debate about that. And you have to remember that when the Romans left Britain abruptly in the early 5th century, the country fragmented into a lot of small kingdoms. And they came and went and absorbed each other and reformed. And it was kind of chaotic, which is one of the reasons why it's a little hard to trace Aldhelm's background. But he eventually became a bishop. I think he's an undervalued figure in the history of Western literature. He is, I think, and again, academia doesn't even seem to be interested in this question anymore, but I think he wrote the first European poem with end rhyme and accentual meter that was not a hymn,
Hmm.
an actual poem. It's called the Carmen Rhythmica. And so he's important that way. Is that a great poem? No. It's an okay poem, but it's not a great poem. And the riddles, which I love, they're a little bit uneven. And I'm sympathetic to this because, it starts with great inspiration. So the first 8 riddles or so, I just adore. And you know that that's the way he started. But then I also relate to this. He ran out of gas. And so they started becoming, he was really looking for what poets today call prompts. And so he would forage through his library, trying to find things that would stir riddles. And sometimes those are magnificent. I love the one on the cauldron, which was also one of the 2 that Richard Wilbur translated. But there are some that are a little bit less spectacular. But overall, they're very interesting. And of course, to understand them fully, I had to do a lot of research. And I figured as long as I was doing that, I ought to do a full-blown commentary, which hadn't been done on Aldhelm before. And it was great fun. I think it's the only translation. Usually when you get towards the end of a translation project, it just sucked the life out of you and you're happy when it's over. You're glad you did it, but happy that it's over. The one where I was sad that it was over was the Aldhelm, because the commentary and figuring out what was really being said in these poems, which scholars hadn't worked out for most of them. It was like a scavenger hunt, of the 7th and 8th and 6th centuries, and it was great fun in a way that translating often is not fun. So I loved them, and the riddles set off a whole riddle tradition. The Old English riddles, the Exeter riddles, are really based on Aldhelm. Some of them are just translations, basically, of Aldhelm. And Gregory the Great and others developed riddle collections. And it was a popular form going well into the Middle Ages, and then it kind of petered out. So he was very influential. He apparently was a very charismatic man. There are anecdotal accounts that he had an evangelical mission, because Britain was not predominantly Catholic and Christian in those days. There was still very heavy pagan representation. So he was really looking for ways to bring people into the faith. And the riddles have that purpose, and it is sort of palpable. He was also alleged to have tried to recruit people when, I guess, it wasn't going so well in his church. He would stand in front of the church and sing in Old English to lure people into the church. Now, whether that's true or not, who knows? But that's the story that about a century after his death started being reported. And you do get that sense that, that's consistent with his manner. He clearly had a little bit of a temper too. It's sort of interesting for me. There are a few cheap shots at the Irish in some of his prose, which I had, took a little personally once in a while. But but he's a major figure. One of the disappointments for me is that I was hopeful that the book would get read more, get a little bit more attention. My press didn't really help me out at all on that. And in particular, I've been thinking in recent years, if you're teaching Latin in a homeschool environment, it really is a marvelous opportunity. Little pieces that are short are a lot less discouraging, I think, to teenagers. If there's an amusing aspect to it, then that's helpful. And then it's everything that's in the back. Not all of it's going to be interesting to someone studying Latin for the first time, but a lot of it is. Why does the punchline for this riddle work? And so I still would love to see, with the burgeoning homeschool movement in classical studies, I still have this dream that people will start picking up the Aldhelm and using it a little bit.
Would you like to read a couple of his riddles so people get a sample?
Sure. So I have two favorites. So as I mentioned, the first, really 7, are different in character from the rest, and you can tell it's the original inspiration, and they have a mystical quality to them. And you'd see mysticism in Latin poetry, Christian Latin poetry, much more often in the coming centuries. But at this point, it was still pretty unusual. And so I've always liked this one. You want me to read it to you and try to guess the answer to it?
Sure.
So this is number 6. I share now with the surf one destiny. In rolling cycles when each month repeats. As beauty in my brilliant form retreats, so too the surges fade in cresting sea.
Well, I think I might have read this online and seen the solution for this, but is this the moon?
It's the moon.
Yeah.
The moon. Yeah. And the other one. So I took a seminar in college under Harold Bloom, so I'm very aware of the anxiety of influence. And I have never felt it more than when I translated 49, because Richard Wilbur, who was always a great inspiration to me and someone who I got to know because of this book, and I believe it's the last book he ever blurbed, translated 2 of Aldhelm's riddles, including this one, 49. And I think this came out really well. I probably worked twice as hard on this one as any of the others because I knew it was going to be compared to Richard Wilbur's, and I didn't want to look, I didn't want to be embarrassed by the comparisons. 49. As pounded gaping metal, wide, gross, round, I hang untouched by boundless sky or ground. Glowing in flames and fevering with bubbles, I thus confront 2 fronts with different troubles, as I survive both being scorched and drowned. So I'll let you off the hook early on this one. So this is a cauldron, and it has paradox as a way of accessing truth. You've got the being both scorched and drowned, and the cauldron in this time period was a symbol of hell, which makes sense, when you think about it. So it's a poem, it's a riddle with, I think, some serious Christian underpinnings that, probably not obvious right at the beginning. And I think a lot of the riddles are this way, and that, I think, again, makes them a good teaching tool, because at some point you can access most of these pretty quickly, figure out what's going on some basic level, and figure out how to get to the answer. But then if you look at them a second and a third time, you start understanding why he wrote it in the first place and what the underpinnings are. And there is this serious Christian underpinning to a lot of the joke. Basically.
Could this be compared to like the tradition of the bestiary in medieval times with a kind of a moralistic slant? Because these poems are not on, from what I understand, mostly the riddles are not about, Christian theology on the surface, or they're about things in the natural world, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great observation. So I'd like to think there are about a dozen things about Aldhelm that I noticed in this book that hadn't been previously noted in the literature. Some of them are so obscure we would put your listeners to sleep if I started talking about them. But one of them is exactly what you said, is the medieval bestiaries. And so one of the great things about doing this work in this time period is it's much easier to look smarter than you really are, because there are computerized databases that cover most of Latin literature. So if you're trying to figure out where things came from, you can go through and very systematically figure out, where some things were taken from. And I figured out something that I think the few scholars who deign to get in this area, always just want to assume that authors were reading the canonical works. And that's not the way the world works a lot of the time. So Aldhelm, the bestiaries were really important. A lot of these poems are drawn from the bestiaries. He liked to travel. He took one trip to Rome. As far as we know, that's the only trip that he took. But he loved travel literature, and that's considered by classicists and medievals to be junky stuff. Some of it is, not all of it is, but some of it's junky stuff. But he loved that, so there's a lot of influence of those texts on the riddles. And there are other areas of less highbrow literature that he enjoyed as well.